Well, talking of dividing lines, I'm joined tonight by the former Finance Secretary Jane Hutt, the Shadow Finance Secretary Nick Ramsey, and from our Westminster studio by Plaid Cymru's Treasury spokesperson Jonathan Edwards. You're all very welcome, and let's start with the big picture, and let's start with you, Jonathan Edwards. Was this a good or a bad budget for Wales?
Well, I think what the budget brought home more than any of the other budgets I've watched since I became a Member of Parliament 8 years ago is that the major fiscal event in Wales now is the Welsh Government's budget, because really, until he got to the banner consequential for Wales, all the spending commitments that were announced in the budget were England only.
And isn't that as it should be, as far as you're concerned?
Oh yeah, well of course, I'm more than happy to welcome that as a development, but it shows that we need to have far greater coverage and scrutiny, really, of the Welsh Government's budget when we get to that event in the Assembly. It's a major event now, and impacts on all aspects of Welsh policy, as it should.
Okay, if I can drag you back to the good or bad question, was it a good or a bad budget?
Well, as always, when it comes to a Westminster budget, it's not what the Chancellor says that really is the key point of interest. It's what the OBR says in their independent assessment. And if you look at their economic growth forecasts, again, stagnating at around a half of what growth levels were before the recession in 2008. And the very interesting point is this huge decoupling that's happened since the European referendum between the British economy and advanced economies, America and other members of the G7. We're growing at around a half of their level, a huge loss in revenue, and that was the real story, I think, of the budget going forward, because those OBR projections, of course, are on the optimistic end, because as they say in their report, they can't forecast what would happen if the British government's very optimistic Brexit scenarios don't come to light. So I fear we'll be having another budget in a few months.
You may well be right, and we'll be talking about issues related to that in a moment. Jonathan Edwards, maybe not the end of austerity, and I could see you shaking your head when Nick Ramsey was talking. Maybe not the end of austerity, but the beginning of the end of austerity, surely.
Oh, I'm afraid this is desperate political spin by the British government, isn't it? Jane rightly mentioned the IFS that said that there would need to be at least £19 billion worth of spending commitments in this budget. Our rough calculations is around a half of that, 11 billion. And the key point is when you look at public expenditure as a percentage of GDP, we are still on a trajectory to go lower than what Thatcher did at the end of her term in government. If anybody thinks that's the level of public expenditure leading to the end of austerity, I think they're living in cloud cuckoo land.
Jonathan Edwards, what do you make of the bringing forward of the the increase in the threshold to 12,500 before you start paying income tax? Bringing that forward a year, that's good news for your constituents, isn't it?
Well, I think the major issue is, as Jane was saying, it's disproportionate. It's a regressive policy in the relation that people who are on higher incomes will have greater benefit. But I think in terms of, I think it highlights maybe one of the problems we're going to face in Wales with the partial income tax devolution we've seen devolved by the British government, a different setup to what's been made available to Scotland. And when you're raising the basic rate in this manner, it will have a disproportionate impact on the Welsh budget, and of course that will have a huge impact on investment in public services.
Jonathan Edwards, I'm beginning to lose my way in this conversation. I think we were talking about whether the amount is all it's cracked up to be. Do you think it is that amount, or do you think that do you tend to agree with Jane Hutt that it's a much lower figure?
Well, when it comes to these banner consequentials, of course, it's important to note it's not just the British government magic money for Wales off the magic money tree. This is a result of spending commitments made for England. And the big issue we face in Wales, of course, is that Scotland and Northern Ireland have a far more favourable rate than us. And really, if I was a Conservative or a Labour politician, my priority would be ensuring that Wales gets equal funding compared to Scotland and Northern Ireland. That would have a huge impact on our ability to fund our public services in Wales.
Just on that, and this is a very specific point, Nick Ramsey used the figure 4.1% earlier on, and the UK government says that 4.1% that Wales has seen as an increase in its funding is more than Scotland and Northern Ireland. So doesn't that deal with the point that you've been you were making?
We get considerably less funding per head than Scotland and Northern Ireland. But the business rates question is a very interesting one as well, because obviously that was one of the key things. Should the Welsh government follow suit? Well, that's one of the key things framed before the budget in press dispatches. But that's a tax cut. and I was completely unaware, and maybe I don't understand the Barnett formula maybe, but I didn't realise that British government tax cuts for England led to Barnett consequentials for Wales, unless of course there's a compensation for local authorities in England for the lost revenues they'll receive as a result of that policy. There's nothing clear about how that will impact on Wales in the budget statement. And there's a big danger here, of course. The British government's got a huge range of fiscal tools. Business rates is a very small part of their fiscal firepower. For Wales, business rates take up a huge element of the devolved taxes. So it's very difficult for the Welsh government to act in the same manner.
Can I change the subject to something that it seems to be clear anyway, and that's the North Wales growth deal, an announcement of £120 million. Starting with you, Jonathan Edwards, there are some questions, I grant, but welcome news?
Well, I think we're seeing the same sort of shenanigans as we saw with the Swansea City deal, with the British government effectively paying around 10% of the whole portfolio of money for the growth deals, and the rest of that money coming from the Welsh public sector and the Welsh private sector. And
yeah, but the UK government
underwrites
underwrites effectively, doesn't it? I mean, not the whole project, but they sort of act as a trigger for the rest of the funding.
But the vast majority of that money is coming from the Welsh public and private sector. So it's a bit rich for a chancellor here in Westminster to stand up and try and proclaim it as some huge giveaway by the British government to the people of Wales. It's Welsh public sector money and Welsh private sector money that's funding these growth deals.
Okay. Jonathan Edwards, this increase in borrowing powers, that must be welcome to you, because I think your party would agree that it's important. Should it go on the M4?
Well, I think the only problem with what I've read in the Budget Red book, and it's page 66, and this announcement on the extra borrowing powers for Wales, is that it's completely tied on spending it on the M4 and on the British government's preferred M4 route.
Thank you for reading page 66 for me.
What we're seeing is the British government essentially trying to dictate Welsh government policy. That's not how devolution works.